New Thinking Aloud is a non-profit endeavor. Your contributions to the New Thinking Aloud Foundation make a meaningful difference in our ability to produce new videos.
Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Emmy Vadnais, co-host with Jeffrey Mishlove. My guest today is Christopher Noël, who holds a master's degree in philosophy from Yale University and a master's in fine arts from Vermont College of Fine Arts, where he taught for 20 years. He also researches the phenomenon of Sasquatch. He is author of several books, including In the Unlikely Event of a Water Landing, A Geography of Grief, Mind Speak, Tapping into Sasquatch and Science, There Is No Veil, At Play in the Vast Here and Now, and UAPs and the Afterlife, How New Disclosures Support Centuries of Psychic and Spiritual Research, which is the topic of our conversation today. Christopher is located in Montpelier, Vermont. Now I'll switch over to the internet video. Welcome, Christopher. It's wonderful to have you back with me on New Thinking Aloud today.
Thank you very much, Emmy. It's great to be here. I love this channel, and it's a privilege to be interviewed by you.
The last time we spoke, you were interviewed on New Thinking Aloud, and we discussed your previous book, There Is No Veil. And I'll link to that interview in the upper right corner of your screen. And it seems that in your current book, UAPs in the Afterlife, that you took those same concepts of essentially the invisible world, centuries of psychic and spiritual research, and have applied that into what might be the missing link with UFOs and UAP.
Yeah, what I learned through my research for the first book directly informs what I am trying to do in the current book to try to understand UAPs and the whole visitors phenomenon within the same framework that I explored the spiritual realm of phenomena in my last book. So the basic idea is that, as the physicist David Bohm put it, the universe is one undivided single whole thing. There are no other places. It's all one place. And that has kind of inspired me, or been my conceptual sort of foundation for everything that I'm trying to look at now. I think that there is no veil or barrier in any objective sense. The tried and true metaphor of the veil or the barrier between this world and the afterlife is really, I think, just a subjective formulation. It's a mirage. It's a state of mind, because we all know, or those of us who look into this area, know that there are people who see dead folks. I see dead people, not me, but they see dead people, frequently. And there are gifted mediums who can see, your deceased mother standing near you. And so there's no veil for them. So if there's no veil for them, there's no sort of objective absolute barrier, full stop. Because most of us can't see the other frequency range where the spirit or spirits operate, doesn't mean that it's not right here in the same space co-located with us. It's just that we can't attune to it. Most of us can't attune ourselves to that. So I want to read a short quote by Alan Watts. Imagine going through a gate in a wall. Here is this great barrier. You walk through it, you turn around, and the wall and the gate have both disappeared. And you see that you were always here. So that's kind of sort of a banner under which my thinking is evolving, and many other people's thinking. I'm not very original, but I'm trying to forge an understanding of the whole panoply of phenomena in UFOs, the afterlife, spiritual encounters, and psychic research, psi research, trying to see those all under the same sort of umbrella of the fact that everything is in one place, and the differences are to be understood as differences in frequency and vibration, rather than necessitating constructing another dimension, a wholesale different sort of reality, like a parallel universe or wormhole to some other realm. It's all the same realm.
It seems that many people are trying to understand what UFOs are, what are aliens, what is the whole phenomenon that's also been dubbed UAP, or unidentified aerial phenomenon, or unidentified anomalous phenomenon. And we tend to think of some of these spaceships as physical structures, and I suppose they may be. But folks like Jacques Vallée, John E. Mack, and others, Whitley Strieber, have suggested that there is a consciousness component to this. And what you really seem to flush out in your book is how that the spiritual and psychic research of parapsychology for over 150 years plus really supports that this could be an aspect that is all right here, right now, versus thinking that it's, like you say, another dimension, or that that there's some separateness going on.
Yeah, especially in Jacques Vallée's many books, it's clear that a great percentage of eyewitnesses see these craft as both physical and non-physical. They sometimes will appear out of nowhere and disappear into thin air. But they also are solid objects. Many have commented on this. And I think from my perspective in this worldview, I'm trying to substantiate here in my work recently, it's a matter of coming into manifestation at our frequency level. And John Keel was big on this. He saw one big super frequency that encompasses all possible experience. And, like gods are on this super frequency, and spirits are, and these visitors are. And anything else that falls outside our everyday reality frame is all part of this frequency. But for him, it was an electromagnetic frequency. And for me, it's a frequency of matter and energy, but not on the electromagnetic scale or a spectrum. That's within our type of matter. And there's a whole other type of matter which is all around us that doesn't get enough play, I feel. And that's this invisible matter that's never been directly detected and measured by our most sophisticated instruments. And it's also called dark matter. And many people think that dark matter is just some sort of cloudy substance that exists out in the cosmos and helps to form, or actually is solely responsible for forming stars and galaxies. But in fact, it suffuses all galaxies and all star systems. And it's unclear, because we can't measure it directly, but only through its gravitational effect at a large scale. We can't know exactly how much of it is here in this room with you and me, and as compared to how much of it is out in space. But since it suffuses everywhere, according to our best estimates so far, there might be 5 times more mass in this unseen kind of matter. And of course, by matter, I also mean energy, because they're two sides of the same coin. There might be 5 times as much of it in our room than the ordinary matter. There might be twice as much. But even if we take the conservative end of that spectrum, twice as much, that's twice as much mass. And these unseen particles must be so small to be not so far detected that it's unimaginable, it's unfathomable how many of these per ordinary matter particle, all the air molecules and the lamp molecules and the wood molecules in our tables and chairs, there must be trillions of times more invisible particles, because the mass is at least equal or twice as much, but at least equal, even more conservative, to the mass of ordinary matter. So my whole thrust has been to try to give more due to the role of this unseen or invisible matter in the so far unexplainable phenomena of psychic research and spiritual experience. I mean, it's fascinating to me that although millions of people have interacted with spirits, and thousands of people have been in hundreds of thousands of people over 150 years and more have been in seances with a physical medium in which they've seen objects levitating, they've seen objects appearing out of nowhere, they've seen objects disappearing into thin air. It seems that bizarre that we have not the foggiest notion so far of how this happens. And we're leaving on the table, or we're leaving off to one side, unaccountably, this invisible stuff that exists all around us. And it's not just particles, it's energy. It's energy. And we need, in order to understand how things can be levitated or how spirits can manifest, we need some other sort of energy and matter than what we so far know about in terms of legacy physics, And so why shouldn't it be this that's all around us?
So let's explore these a little bit further. So we have ordinary matter, which is what people perceive as the physical or the material world. Our bodies, the computers we're using, the cameras we're using, what we see, the table and so forth. And then there is the invisible matter, which is what we don't see. You're suggesting that there's a lot we don't see, and others have suggested that too. And additionally, I think the piece that you put forward is that consciousness is part of this invisible matter as well.
Yes, and it's not just what we don't see, it's what we can't even get a theoretical grip on so far, because there's a lot of ordinary matter that we don't see too, like the air in front of us. But this dark matter, which I'm calling invisible matter, because it's not dark. It's kind of a misnomer, and it can bring in sort of implications of some moral shading, and it's just invisible matter. So it's this enormous amount, 5.5 times in the universe is the best estimate, 5.5 times more of this invisible matter than ordinary matter. Now, the role of consciousness is a tough one, and people use consciousness in 1,000 different ways. It's a big, fuzzy, nebulous term often. I have learned, since writing the earlier book, I've learned about quantum field theory. Now, of course, when you hear the Q word, if you're like me, you get all kind of wiggy and scared. But don't worry. All it is that for the last 100 years, and increasingly, physicists have come to realize that the most fundamental building block in the universe is not particles, but these fluid-like fields, these fields of energy. And when the energy gets excited to a certain point, that's a technical term, excited, it forms a packet of energy, and this is the particles that we then come to interact with. So the underlying thing is this fluid-like grouping of fields throughout the universe and throughout this room I'm in, and these fields give rise to all the particles that we know of in ordinary matter. Now, I think that consciousness, for reasons I can go into soon, it is also a field. It's a field, and as such, I think it must give rise to some sort of matter and energy. I don't agree with the sort of Cartesian tradition of this dualism between the material world and the non-material world. I think we need to transcend the small m materialism that we've all been conducting our experience of the world within, and go to a capital M materialism, which includes both ordinary matter and this invisible matter. Because in order for consciousness to create, say, to be able to accomplish psychokinesis, PK, either micro psychokinesis with random number generators and such, and macro psychokinesis where people can make a piece of tinfoil spin around even inside a glass container, or some people can make objects levitate, as we'll get to also. In order for consciousness to be able to effect these changes in the small m material world, it must be working within a larger frame of materialism, what I'm calling the capital M materialism, because it really is, to me, absurd to think of non-something affecting something, or the non-physical interacting in a direct way to make a chair rise up in the air. It's got to be something physical, but we have had zero satisfying explanations put forward over all this time that people have been experiencing these phenomena. People just say, well, geez, it must be, some sort of energy, but there is no such energy that ever gets detected by instruments. So what kind of energy is it? It's something outside of the ordinary. So I think that we need to fully capitalize upon the varieties of reality that we have on our current radar screen, and not sort of section off or barricade off not just one whole half of the radar screen, but 85% of the radar screen, which is this invisible matter. And when it comes to dark matter, invisible matter, there are two schools of thought. One is that it is this sort of diffuse, cold, inert, non-self-interacting substance that just kind of hangs out and has a gravitational effect on ordinary matter. But the other school of thought is that it's self-interacting. And Avi Loeb, the famous Harvard physicist who's been much in the news lately for his studies of interstellar objects, and he's a big contributor to the conversation about the UAP subject. He says that it's possible that dark matter is self-interacting. He says this would allow for the possibility that there are dark atoms that emit dark radiation and condense into dark stars and dark planets that support dark chemistry that leads to life as we do not know it. In such a case, the answer to Fermi's question, where is everybody, would be, you are blind to most of them. And this gets back to this notion that we're in one place, that the universe is one undivided whole, and that all of these others that we only sometimes come in contact with and are normally invisible are existing right in the same place. There's no elsewhere. And that it really comes down to vibration. Einstein said everything is vibration. And I think that I take that as a kind of a guidepost also. Avi Loeb said further, he said that in order to understand the nature of dark matter, what we need are some anomalies that would hint at what the nature of dark matter is. And my point is, what could be more fitting for this call for anomalies than psychic phenomena and spiritual phenomena that are as anomalous as it gets.
And UAP.
And we throw into that UAPs that act just the same way. That this is fascinating. This has been fascinating to me, is that the range of phenomena that people report, that contactees report and abductees report in association with these visitors, is the very same. It's a deeply akin to what you experience in a physical mediumship seance. These spaceships appear out of nowhere, and so do apports. Apport is a word meaning, from the French, to bring. And in the context of seances, it's objects appearing out of nowhere. Just they drop from thin air, invisible matter, into our frequency of matter, and they just, bounce on the floor. On June 20th of this past summer, I was lucky enough to attend a seance in Western New York at the Lilydale Spiritual Assembly, a wonderful, cute little village that is peopled by psychics. And they have to pass a rigorous series of trials in order to be allowed to reside there and to work with sitters, with clients. And I was at a seance there, and out of space, I felt a spirit hand. And that spirit hand handed me this. It's a little pebble. I think perhaps if I polished it, it would be, I could see that it's some sort of crystal or gem, but I'm not sure. It might just be an ordinary rock. Point is, it came out of nowhere, just like UAPs come out of nowhere. And in seances, lots of times things will levitate. In this seance, I saw two objects levitate. I saw them go up with no hands, no ordinary hands, no small m material hands, lift up from the floor to the ceiling and suspend there for 45 minutes. These were these two trumpets, these seance trumpets. The people who know about seances will know what they are. Voices will sometimes speak through them, but that's a separate matter. I saw with my own eyes these levitations. Leslie Keane, who is instrumental in the UAP field and whose groundbreaking New York Times piece with Ralph Blumenthal kind of blew the lid off of the latest round of disclosures back in 2017. Leslie Keane, who is has an impeccable record of honesty and precision and care. She goes regularly to the seances of physical medium Stuart Alexander in England, and she sees levitations too. She has said, when you can sit in a room and watch objects levitate before your eyes, which I've done many times, and so have many others, there's got to be a physics, a scientific explanation of what is going on to make that happen. And I wish that more scientists were curious about this, don't we all? This is actually happening, she says. Where's the curiosity? And I love that, because she is not going to make things up. She wrote this groundbreaking book about UFOs, where generals and military men came off on the record for the first time for her. And she's extremely fastidious in her research, and she's experienced these levitations. But the weird thing is that when those scientists and military personnel who have been attempting for 75 years, ever since Roswell, to understand the science, as she says, the physics behind the propulsion and the anti-gravity behavior of these ships, they've been all working within small m materialism. They've been trying to understand how you can create an anti-gravity electromagnetic engine, how you can perhaps create warp drive, which means you bend space and time in a sort of an envelope or bubble around the craft, so then the craft doesn't have to be under the control or governed by the outside gravity. It has its own gravitational field within this bubble. But nobody, it seems, or not that I know of, is taking advantage of the rich 150-year history of spiritualist and psychic research. The spiritualist movement started in 1848 and is still going, although it ebbs and flows in terms of the current zeitgeist and the resistance of small m materialism. But it's continuing to this day. That's how come I was able to go and have this seance experience. And so I think that it's very strange that researchers are not taking advantage of the treasure trove of absolutely incontrovertible evidence and proof that has been assembled by researchers over these past 150 years. If you're interested in learning about this, there are 4 books I would recommend. William Crook's from the old days, there's three. William Crookes researches in the phenomena of spiritualism. Nobel Prize winner Charles Richet, his book is called 30 Years of Psychical Research. Then you have Arthur Conan Doyle's History of Spiritualism, an excellent book. He devoted the last 25 years of his life to researching these very topics. And as we know, he's no slouch when it comes to evaluating evidence, because his main character in his famous books was a wizard at that. And then in the current day, back to Leslie Kean, she not only has written seminal works on the UAP phenomenon, but has written Surviving Death, in which she, with a contemporary prism, looks at the history of all this research and why it's so persuasive. So those four books, if you read them, you'll agree with me, I think, that much, much more of this fertile ground and what has grown from it needs to be harvested in our current attempt to understand these otherwise inexplicable phenomena.
So going back to when you were talking about fields and spectrum of frequencies, I just want to flush that out a little bit more for our listeners and our viewers, because the last time we spoke, you gave a really nice analogy about ice and water and how perhaps these frequencies are really on a continuum.
Well, I think the entire world, including the afterlife and all the strange goings-on in our universe, can be plotted conceptually, if not yet physically measured, by a vast spectrum of frequencies, many of which are above what we've ever experienced and what our instruments are calibrated to understand, our scientific instruments, even the finest of them. We down here is a relative term, but are made of dense matter, small m, materialist matter. And as we go further up, we can't see and we can't perceive what's up there. But to a person, those who have come back and talked through channelers and voice mediums have said, well, we exist in a finer, a more rarefied type of environment. So in terms of fields, what I forgot to say earlier is that I've been fascinated to learn that the whole notion of a field takes away the problem of so-called action at a distance. Isaac Newton was concerned, well, how does gravity, he worked out the laws of gravity, but had no idea how to understand how gravity could work between, say, the sun and the earth, 93 million miles distant from each other. What was the medium in between? And Faraday had the same problem with the electromagnetic fields. But in the wake of those two researchers, it's become clear that the nature of a field is that there is no action at a distance. There is local perturbations, it's called, local changes that are local through the medium of space, and then they reach the other object, and the action is local there too. Like Einstein's curvature of space-time, there's no force, there's no distant action between the sun and the earth. It's that space-time itself is curved, and the earth responds to the local effect of that curve right there. There's no distance involved. And this is why quantum entanglement can really be understood as not being a matter of great distance. Like you can take two photons, one photon, split it into two, and then remove them by light years from each other, and they'll still respond simultaneously to any changes. This is the whole mystery of entanglement. But it's not that mysterious when you consider that they're really two aspects of the same object, and that distance itself is an illusion, because there's a field in between that connects, that makes the relationship immediate and contiguous between the two things. There's no separation. In the same way, I think that remote viewing, for instance, proves that consciousness works through the same method, through a field that brings the apparently distant thing right to intimate contact. So talented remote viewers, back in the day and still currently, can be given a set of geographic coordinates, and they can immediately get a vision and sometimes a smell and tactile information from, say, a room in China that they've never been to that has, a book, and they can see the title of that book. And these things are hard, they're mind-boggling, but they've been replicated thousands and thousands of times. And if you look into remote viewing, you'll see. And there are many, many interviews on this channel to that effect. And so in that way, I think that the consciousness must be a field as well, and that there's no genuine sense of distance. We can have telepathic contact with our mother in California when we're sitting in Minnesota. Instantly. There's no kind of transfer of information. There's no message being sent somewhere. There's nothing but immediacy of attunement. So it's a matter of attunement rather than searching for something through a distance. So I know it'll sound a little obtuse to many people, but really it is just that the magic of fields and how they delete the illusion of distance, how a field will bring everything together so that, in fact, the universe is all one. I mean, that's sort of a New Age cliche, but in the sense of even the most advanced of physics theories, these fields unify the universe so that there is no enigma involved in a particle being 7 light years away by conventional measurement, but also being in direct relationship with the particle here on Earth.
Going back to the analogy of ice and water, and can you explain how, when that then moves into vapor, how that correlates to ordinary matter and invisible matter, and how that supports what you see and feel may be going on with UAP?
Well, it's just within ordinary matter, there are different states of matter. There are 4 different states of matter. And if you have a solid, you can see it and touch it. And if you have a gas, you can sometimes see it, but sometimes the gas particles are too small. And water can evaporate, or steam, you can see steam, but then once the steam gets too rarefied, you can't see it, or water evaporates, it becomes a gas that you can't see. So that's all within ordinary matter, of course, and so that becomes an analogy for what happens between ordinary matter and this invisible matter, this majority matter in the universe, and possibly, very likely, majority matter in every place on Earth. So it's really just an analogy to help envision how things can change states. And when people die, very often those who are attending them at their deathbed will actually see their spirit in a vaporous form. So I'm glad you brought up the vapor analogy. They'll see the vaporous spirit rise up above the body, stay there for a little while, often forming into a perfect replica of the dead body, and then rise up. And this might be a little sacrilegious for some, but I see the fact of rising up of the spirit leaving the body as, in a sense, no more esoteric than a high school physics project, because it's moving toward a higher ratio of invisible matter to visible matter. Because as you go up higher in the atmosphere, ordinary matter becomes thinner. And so, comparatively speaking, invisible matter becomes more dominant. The thinner and thinner ordinary matter becomes. So it makes sense that a spirit becoming rarefied, becoming more and more aerated, would go upward.
It goes to a higher frequency.
A higher frequency. And, you could say that it's just a semantic difference to say, is it a higher plane, a higher dimension, or a higher frequency? But for me, the trouble with dimension is it begins to implant a notion of otherness that I don't think is warranted, because our loved ones are never more than a thought away. And when we work with a gifted medium, they can instantly be there. So it's not as though they have to cross some landscape or some series of barriers. They're right here. Because not only are they right here because we share the same space, the same place, but just at different frequencies, but they're right here because there is no such thing as distance. And in fact, there's no such thing as time either. That's an illusion too, because people can predict the future. People can have premonitory dreams or clairvoyant dreams. Precognition is an absolutely well-established phenomenon. Some are gifted in seeing the future, and if you can see the future, it must be there already. Everything is happening at one time, and all space is really one space, is the idea. That's what I'm learning from lots of different sources.
Mm-hmm. I want to share a story that I've never shared before. And my grandmother, when she was passing, my mother and I were with her. I was a teenager. I really didn't know about these concepts to the level that I understand them now. And when my grandmother died, I was in the room with her, with my mother. We were the only two people there. And I actually saw a mist come out of my grandmother's head and float up into the corner of the room, and then it disappeared.
There you go. That's wonderful. I'm so glad that you had that experience. Did you find it comforting or freaky?
Oh, I found it very comforting. And I felt that it felt very natural, actually. That, people talk about like the soul leaving or those kinds of terms. And it was interesting because I could see how it was timed with her last breath. People sometimes will have the apnea where they have longer pauses between their breath before they take their last breath. And she had that, and it felt like a good half minute or more before she had the last breath. And it was like a deep inhalation, a deep exhalation. And on that exhalation, when it ended, that's when I saw this mist come out of her, and it was so subtle. I asked my mother, I don't think she saw it. My mother was very emotional when it happened. But I think that I love my grandmother, but I was able to be more present, I think, to be able to experience that.
Oh, exactly. I love that you were able to experience that, and that it corroborates what I'm saying here. I think that you're an energy worker, so perhaps it is simply the case that you're more able to perceive such things.
Right. Right. That's a whole other conversation, right? That some people are able to perceive these phenomena and others not as much. And that's also to your point around, why aren't some of these materialists with a lower M taking what you're suggesting more seriously and what others have been saying around some of these similar concepts? And it might simply be because they have not had these experiences. And so therefore in their belief system, they just don't exist. And why even give them any time?
Lots of people will refuse to even look at evidence of this sort of thing because it can't be real, For them, it just simply can't be real. And yet there's been zero progress in figuring out how some of this paranormal, how some of these flabbergasting paranormal incidents can occur, such as levitations, by any other explanation. So, we're completely out of gas when it comes to small m materialism. We might as well look further afield, so to speak. I want to read a short quotation. I'm full of quotations today, but this is by Frederick Myers, who's one of the fathers of parapsychology. 31 years after his death, he came through famous and well-tested medium Geraldine Cummins, and he said that it turns out the afterlife, the environment of the afterlife, is so rarefied that it is invisible to the mortal eye and eludes the finest of the instruments of scientists. It is of the material universe. And then Jacques Vallée, the aforementioned Jacques Vallée, quotes a UFO contactee who asked the visitors what they were made of, who they were. And so Vallée, quote, "When asked who they were, the visitors said that they were men composed, as it were, of air." And again, you hear people, abductees, talking about how they feel that their cells are kind of coming apart and they're becoming light and air as they get lifted up through the air, levitated through their room. And this is the thing, when you hear about people seeing the little grays floating, free of gravity, you never think, well, what's the propulsion system? You know, the same thing is true of the UFO ships or craft themselves. We don't have to have a technology, to explain the propulsion system. They're simply sidestepping gravity, just in the same way that a object in a seance can sidestep gravity.
To be fair, it's possible that there are physicists who are considering invisible matter and consciousness in relationship to UFOs and UAP, because we may not know what's really happening. In fact, that's really an area that a lot are hoping we'll get more information about with disclosure.
That could very well be. In fact, in my book, you've seen that near the end, I do quote some people who increasingly are saying there must be a role for consciousness in here, that all these years since Roswell, since 1947, there's been this largely unsuccessful, from what I'm hearing, unsuccessful effort to replicate, to reverse engineer the technology of these vehicles. And they've run up against a brick wall because they can't find the core technology. That's what Gary Nolan says, the core technology that allows these things to defy gravity and to move at speeds that are unimaginable for conventional aircraft. So this core, this X factor, this wild card, is increasingly being suggested as consciousness. But though they're saying this, I don't hear anybody saying, well, luckily we have this vast repertoire, this vast backlog of research into what consciousness is truly capable of. It's not just awareness, it's this field that can both know, have access to all this information, like a book title in a room in China, and can also affect the physical world, not just know the physical world informationally, but can affect it in the other direction. And I don't hear any of these people who are raising the consciousness flag say, well, let's go find out what consciousness can do based on these hundreds of books and testimonials and first-person accounts from the history of spiritualism, psychic research and spiritual research. So they seem to stop there. They say, well, consciousness, and it remains this kind of windy concept or just sort of, undefined. And I'm trying in this book to put parameters around it or give it more flesh, more substance, more texture, so that it can more fruitfully be applied to the problem of UAPs. The problem space is often called by philosophers, like, what's the problem space of this field of inquiry? I'm trying to shrink that space a little bit. I'm still very limited in my understanding, of course. I'm just trying to shrink those boundaries, that frame, a little bit more by introducing and suggesting the already available information we have about the nature and the capacity of consciousness.
I'm grateful that you're making these connections, because the field of parapsychology and the abilities we have with our consciousnesses is very strong. And like you say, there's a lot of evidence of what is possible, although many people don't know about this or will dismiss it out of hand because it goes into what some might refer to as the boggle threshold. And people such as Ted Owens, who are much appreciated and loved Jeffrey Mishlove on New Thinking Aloud, the host and producer of New Thinking Aloud. He wrote a whole book on Ted Owens, who was able to apparently, in many cases, summons these UFO, UAP, and others as well have been able to interact with them through their mind and consciousness, such as people like Chris Bledsoe.
Well, exactly. I think that people aren't aware, or they don't allow themselves to become aware, to do the homework and find out. It's really the area of macro PK is what we're talking about with what the UAPs can do. Macro psychokinesis, which is large-scale things like moving objects, levitating objects, making objects disappear and reappear. Like I got this gift from the spirit hand, which was, by the way, a very material feeling hand, but it wasn't none of the rest of the body was there. It'll freak you out if you go to one of these seances. Macro PK is the key, and yet, as Jeffrey Mishlove has said many times, for some reason, and I guess it is the boggle threshold, macro PK is like the black sheep of parapsychology. It's considered beyond the pale. It's too weird, too impossible, and that's because there's never been anything like a satisfying explanation for it. But it happens, just like the Leslie Kean quotation I read earlier, where she says, if you've seen things levitating, you realize there's some science to it, some physics to it. This is happening. Why aren't people more curious? And scientists, by all rights, ought to be avid for more information. I understand that just me saying, or Leslie Kean saying, that we've seen objects levitate may not be concretely meaningful to many of you. So if you want to see some video of macro PK taking place, there are 2 links in the description. So if you want to see for yourself some examples of current day macro PK, I would recommend going to a channel called Juan Gimeno, which is JUANGIMENO. And search that name and then Ariel Farias, Farias. And this is an Argentinian man who's able to put his hands on the top of a table, and the table will rise up off 2 legs. But of course, even moving a pencil an inch off the desktop is the same thing in kind, though not in degree, from moving an entire car into the air. It's the mere fact of going from 0 to something in terms of levitating an object shows that it's possible. It's a proof of concept. So Ariel in Argentina is able to put his hands on the top of a table, and it tilts up. And this is fully HD video documented in a series of videos that you'll find if you search that. And it's vouched for by a friend of the show, Stephen Browdy, the philosopher in Maryland, who's written a book on macro PK. So there you can see examples of what I'm talking about.
There's even a whole interview where Jeffrey Mishlove interviews Stephen Browdy about table levitation, and I'll link to that interview in the upper right corner of your screen.
Yeah, that was a very important interview for me, for starting to teach me about what's going on currently, not just back in the day. In the spiritualist movement, the heyday of the spiritualist movement. You know, it's the same universe, the same interplay of types of matter, ordinary matter, invisible matter, and all the energies associated with those two that is at our disposal today, just as it was 125 years ago or 5,000 years ago when the ghosts visited Babylonians, as written about by Irving Finkel in yesterday's interview by Emmy.
Yes, there's also an interview with Dr. Irving Finkel. I'll link to that one in the upper right corner of your screen, called Evidence of First Ghosts as well. So, Christopher, what you're suggesting is that apports, levitation, psychic functioning, spiritual experiences, telepathy, all of this is evidence for how UAP, UFOs may be functioning.
Exactly. And that reminds me that I think they're deeply kindred to us because they have 2 eyes, 2 arms, hands, fingers, not always 5 fingers, but they're upright walking, they're bipedal. I think they're deeply connected to us in terms of our evolution. We haven't worked out anywhere near the details of that. They could have been involved in our evolution on some level, but I think that they didn't evolve autonomously on some foreign planet. I think somehow they're of us and we're of them. This whole thing I was talking about a little earlier about the intimacy and that the immediate proximity, the immediate contiguity of all space and all time means that these visitors don't really have to travel. There's no travel from distant light years across light years from a distant planet. And there's no, even if there are future selves, there may not need to be travel through time because all time is one. They, as reported by many abductees, they find themselves outside of linear time as we experience it. And so do those who've experienced near death. They find themselves outside of linear time. And so do those who have passed on and then report back through tried and true mediums that they're outside of linear time. So I don't think there's any need to travel either through space or time for these visitors to manifest themselves in front of us just by modulating or shifting their vibrational level. I think that these UAPs, when they're just coming across the visibility threshold, are like apports when they're beginning to form, are much higher proportion of invisible matter to ordinary matter. And then once they get down closer to the earth and land and people can be touched by them and touch them, then they're temporarily ordinary matter, or a higher proportion of ordinary matter. An odd thing is that all those who try to explain their anti-gravity performance and their maneuverability in terms of known technology can't explain why they don't create a uniform hot heat signature. Many of these UAPs, when they're filmed by a thermal camera, will turn out to be cold, sometimes very cold. And some of you watching this will have heard this and found it baffling. Why would they be cold? Well, I think that's because they don't use any energy in the conventional sense that we understand. If there were a warp drive being employed by these craft, they would give out a tremendous amount of energy, and that they would dump this energy in the form of some sort of energy has to manifest, and we would see an extreme signature of that in terms of heat on our instruments. And we see many the Tic Tac, for instance, that UAP was cold, and so was the Go Fast one. So this coldness, to me, speaks to the role of invisible matter, because the thinner that matter gets, the less kinetic energy it has, and so it's colder. I think this is why when people feel spirits in a room, in a haunted house, they'll feel cold. And they'll sometimes have symptoms similar to altitude sickness. I think the pressure drops because the ordinary air gets diffused by the inrush of a higher proportion of this invisible matter, and they'll get headaches just like people at altitude, mountain climbers. So I think that there's a connection between those temperature indications of shifting ratio of these matter types with the cold displays of UAPs when they enter our atmosphere.
You've mentioned some examples with near-death experiences and people who, like yourself, have experienced apports or have seen, like myself, a spiritual mist. You've suggested that there's a connection between UAP and the afterlife. Is there any more you want to share about that?
Yes, I could have called the book UAPs and Consciousness, but I didn't, because consciousness, as I said, is such an often used and a word that has so many different interpretations depending on who you talk to that it would just seem too nebulous to me. And the afterlife is nothing but consciousness. It's our consciousness that survives bodily death and rises up and joins a whole different, more rarefied environment of life, of continued existence, but in a different form of matter and energy. In the final chapter of this book, I talk about some resonances between the afterlife as we can understand it, to the extent we can understand it in our mortal shell, through our mortal prism here, and what we understand so far about the nature of these visitors. I think they share a similar vibrational neighborhood, but they're not one and the same. Whitley Strieber says that he's seen, when he's been taken by some of these visitors, he's seen some of his dead relatives. I think they're sort of neighbors, is what I'm saying. But I know that they're not, I think that I know that their visitors are not just our dead. I think that they're able to traffic in the same frequency range, but I don't think they go up to what we would call heaven. I don't think they continue to evolve into higher and higher forms of knowledge and learning and just spiritual development. I think that's why we continue to see them hanging around. If they were able to transcend and find ecstasy, as I think we do eventually in our journey, they wouldn't continue boomeranging back down to these dense lowlands where we live here in the ordinary world. I think they're sort of stuck in between modes, and they can go some of the way toward heaven, although that's not in a Christian sense, but, in a general sense of transcendence to a higher form of existence. I think they can go some of that way, and they take their abductees some of that way, and some abductees feel like they're being taken toward heaven, but of course they don't wind up there. They wind up in some austere, sterile sort of operating theater, or a sort of a metal tank kind of thing, which is not as good as going to heaven. I think the visitors, the abductors, can't take us that far. I think they're limited, and so they go as far as they can, and then they come back down, and they go up, and they come back down, and perhaps, just perhaps, they've been trying to merge with us and trying to probe our bodies all these millennia in order to try to find out how they can get a soul like ours. Perhaps our limit is higher than their limit, and they want some of what we have.
And it may be a bit of conjecture, because there may also be different types of these beings and different agendas or intentions, or even their own evolution of their consciousness. For example, some may consider that angels may even fall into this realm. But again, this is all, we're all wanting to understand this better. And of course, everybody has their own experiences and beliefs.
Yeah, we're grasping at straws, but I'm glad you introduced that, because I'm really just talking as if there's one kind, and I know that there are more than one kind. From reading John Mack and many other people, I think it's true that people do get abducted by the small grays and get operated on by larger ones. But I don't know, there may be an entire array of civilizations, many people think. So, I only can conjecture on what I've come to understand, albeit sketchily. It's all through a glass darkly so far.
However, you are familiar with a species known as Sasquatch. And so do you see any parallels between what we perceive with UAP and that phenomena?
Yeah. My work up until a couple of years ago has been studying the Sasquatch species, and many paranormal qualities are experienced in association, in proximity to members of that species. People see them disappearing, for instance. One of my good friends down in Texas, who's eminently trustworthy, was with a friend of hers. They were driving, and the Sasquatch walked out in front of their car and then disappeared. There were no trees that it was hiding behind. There was no camouflage sort of situation involved. It disappeared, and it was lucky that there was a passenger there because they could compare notes. And it's not that the Sasquatch kind of interrupted their cognition so that it could run away into the forest, because they were driving, and so there was a smooth, uninterrupted flow of perception, because they continued driving straight and this thing disappeared and there was no interruption in what they were doing. I think the Sasquatch, either in the flesh, can disappear, or more likely that they're dead. Their spirit forms are more adept than ours at modulating their vibrations and manifesting here on this plane of frequency, this frequency plane. And I wrote a whole book on telepathy between our species and the Sasquatch species called Mind Speak. I feel like the Sasquatch species stands in relation to the human race, like a person's individual spirit guides stand in relation to them. I think that they're intimately involved somehow, and if it's true that the aliens played a role in our evolution, they may too have played a role in Sasquatch evolution, and we may be all involved in some hybridization bonanza that we're only beginning to scratch the surface of.
Christopher, thank you so much for sharing what may be the missing link in UFOs and UAP, and for highlighting the more than 100 years of parapsychology research and evidence of psychic functioning and spiritual experiences. Thank you.
I really appreciate your questions, and you drew out things that I was forgetting to say, and it's really a lucky sort of stage for me to be invited onto. I really appreciate it. I just worked hard on this book, and I'm proud of it, and I hope that it'll shed a little light from a different angle from most of the discussion that's going on as we, this year, 2024 is set to be, is poised to be one of the inflection points in the entire history of disclosure. And I'm grateful and honored to be part of the conversation. That's all I want to do.
Christopher, thank you so much for being with me today. And for those of you listening or watching, thank you for being with us. You are the reason that we are here.
I imagine that by now many of you already realize that, in conjunction with White Crow Books, we've just launched the new Thinking Aloud Dialogues book imprint, and our first title is There Life After Death?